Hi, friends. I'm Asiatu,
And I'm Mary.
and together we're the Audacious Autistics podcast. We're both queer, non-binary, intuitive coaches creating a safe space to discuss everything from autism to astrology, including social justice, intersectionality, and more, living unmasked and out loud.
Today, we're releasing a bonus episode that would normally go out to our Patreon family. So we want to take a moment to thank our patrons on this episode. You are so appreciated. If you are into receiving more personalized content and you're able to support us financially, we would love to have you on our Patreon. You can find our links in the description. So today we're going to talk more about Autism April and the common community conversations that we've been having this month. If you haven't already listened to our first episode, All the Things Autism April, be sure to check that out. Thank you for tuning in. We're so happy to have you here. So in the All the Things episode 1, we discussed some topics that float around during Autism April and how they can influence our experience as autistics. But there's so much more that we can talk about that we didn't even touch on. So happy Autism April, friends. We're here for another public bonus episode. So where do we even want to start? We have functioning labels that we haven't talked about. We have different terminology. We want to go deeper into ABA. So what do you think, Asiatu? Where do you want to start with today's episode?
Let's talk about person first language. And let me not hit my screen.
Perfect. So person first language versus identity first language, right?
Correct. So person first language is I am autistic. Identity first language is a person with autism.
Mm-hmm.
I always get those confused, which is why I was pausing. But the reason why
hashtag autism.
exactly. So the reason why person first language is so important is because autism is not something that can be separated from the individual. Clearly, we're autistic from inception, and we will be for the rest of our lives. It's not something that can be cured or changed or separated. It's not an accessory. It's not like it can be worn. It's not like we can take it off at any moment. Very much similar to our race and other identities. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people have issue with on the spectrum words literally, because again, it implies that there's a separation between our autism and who we are. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think when we talk about person first language versus identity first language, the thing about identity first language, which is what the majority of autistics prefer. So identity first, meaning, identity first, meaning I am an autistic person, is preferred. So the problems with person first language, which would be I am a person with autism, is, everything that Asiatu already mentioned. And it stems from, so person first language got big back when there was the big AIDS and HIV epidemic. And the goal with person first language was to separate this negative stigma and to reduce the stigma around HIV and AIDS. So they would separate the person from HIV and AIDS. But when you do that with autism and being autistic, where it's not a negative thing to be autistic, using person first language puts a negative stigma on it. Like we don't want to be associated with the fact that we are autistic. And so in that context, with HIV, it makes sense to use person first language, right? We want to see the person, not the disease or the, negative stigma that is tied to it. But in a lot of subcultures within the disability community, identity first is preferred because it's not a negative thing to be autistic. It's something that we are born with, similar to queerness, right? So I am queer, I don't have queer. You know what I mean? Like I am a white person, I don't have white. So
Exactly.
it's just silly to use identity first language. And the other issue with person first language being used for autistic people is it was the people surrounding autistic people that started using person first and push person first. Again, a way to separate us, the autistics, from this thing that neurotypicals don't approve of or don't like or aren't comfortable with. So it's another way to push that cure rhetoric,
Exactly.
by trying to separate us and making it seem like it's not just who we are as people. So yeah.
Yeah, it perpetuates the stigma,
Yes,
basically,
absolutely.
and which is why it needs to stop. And I just want to say again, as I always say, is that we are speaking community standards. So
Yeah.
yes, there are going to be autistics within our community that don't necessarily abide by the community standards, which is their choice because they are a member of the actual community. However, just like any other community, we all have standards as far as language, how we want to be referred to, and specifics, whether it be the queer community, the Black community, women, whatever the case is.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind, that even if you're a person who knows autistic people that prefer different language, that still doesn't mean that you, as a person, not a non-member of the autistic community, get to decide how you interact or engage with others with against our standards. So
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there.
No, I think that's really important to say because I know that that's a conversation that happens a lot within the community. Well, I know someone that is autistic and they prefer the other language, and that's fine too, to use it for them, right? And that's an inner community
Exactly.
conversation that we have. And the other thing that I hear a lot with this conversation is that people don't want to be pigeonholed, right? Like, I'm more than just being autistic, and that's all in air quotes,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay, right? And autistic is just an identifier, and you get to speak to it or openly use it if you want, but you don't have to, right? Autistic is a noun and it's also an adjective. So it describes this quality of people to help you identify, but you don't have to openly use it. If you're not safe or you're not comfortable or, XYZ, that's absolutely fine. But the fact of the matter is that it is an identifier that each of us that is autistic carries with us, even if we don't do it vocally. So taking it and putting it as a separate thing by using person first language is only continuing to push that negative stigma that we already talked about. So, if you're autistic and you don't feel comfortable identifying as autistic, then that's your choice. But as a community, we can see the harm that person first language has caused and the push of it. I mean, even in my personal life, I told someone very close to me that I was autistic when I finally got the nerve to tell someone, I'm autistic. And their immediate reply to me was, "You mean you're a person with autism?" And I was like, "No, that's not what I mean. I mean, I'm proudly autistic."
Exactly.
And so there's, it's that stigma that we're going to talk about a lot more in depth in our next episode, actually. But it's those little things that might not be seen as an issue, which is why we talk about them. So
Exactly.
yeah, perfect. So anything else about person first language or identity first language that you want to cover here?
Nope. I think that's it. I think we did everything for that.
Cool. So I do want to kind of just run through some examples just to let people know, because I know it's difficult. I mean, they've heard us struggle back and forth with remembering which one's which. So I just kind of want to end
I
this
was
conversation with a little bit of an
I was
example
just about to
list.
say, I don't even know if what I said initially was even accurate or not, because I always confuse them.
Right. And
I
it's
I
super difficult.
confuse the language of it, but I don't
The
confuse
name.
what it actually means. So
right.
I know that I am, autistic. I refer to other autistics as autistic, but the
whether it's
term
PFL or
itself,
IFL is
IFL,
confusing.
exactly. Then I'm just
For
like,
sure.
I don't know. Hashtag autistic.
Yes, for sure. So some examples of identity first language, and identity first language, again, is what is commonly preferred by actual autistics. So those are going to be autistic person or autistic people. I am autistic. She is autistic. They are autistic. We are autistic. I have a brother who is autistic. That person is an autistic, right? So those are all identity first language. Person first language is going to be that is a person with autism, or that is a person who has autism, or that is a person on the spectrum. So on the spectrum and with ASD are harmful. They are person first language. So that's something that sometimes gets missed, right? So person with autism, person with ASD, person on the spectrum. My brother is on the spectrum. So all of those things are PFL, and they are a big no for the majority of the autistic community. So I hope that has helped kind of bring that conversation together a little bit for us.
Or I am a parent of a child with autism.
Oh, yes.
We see a lot. Or I am a parent of a child with, on the spectrum. So, you're a parent of an autistic child.
Yes. My child is autistic.
My child is autistic.
And as we're having this conversation, autism moms are only mothers that are autistic. So when you see someone saying like that I'm an autism mom, that's normally a neurotypical person or someone that is not autistic who is taking their child's identity to form their own identity, and it is harmful. So as we're talking about like, my child on the spectrum, we can also kind of throw that in there for terminology. Like if you aren't autistic, please don't take that label as your own. You are a parent or a caregiver or a loved one or a family member of someone that is autistic.
Exactly.
So just want to put that out there while we're here.
Which I'm sure at some point we'll discuss.
Yes, I am sure we will go deeper into that conversation. Cool. So anything else on that part?
Nope, I think we're good on that.
Sweet. So ABA is something that we touched on in episode 1 of our podcast, kind of briefly. We didn't explain it very much. And so we want to take a moment to just kind of step back and have that ABA conversation one more time. So ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis, and it's a type of therapy that's used on autistics, sometimes other people, but mostly on autistics, normally children. And it's something that teaches them how to better function in society through positive reinforcement. So this is all in quotes. So it supposedly teaches them how to better function in society through positive reinforcement. But there is a wide range of issues with that. So let's talk about it. Where do we want to start with ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis?
I just want to say that historically, let's start at the very beginning. ABA was created by the same person that did gay conversion therapy. Mm-hmm. So a lot of autistics refer to ABA as conversion therapy for autistics, which is basically exactly what it is. Yeah. It's to quote unquote normalize autistics to the point where they can quote unquote pass for neurotypical, mm-hmm. at the expense of being who they authentically are and suppressing everything that makes them autistic. It's also behavioral compliance. So it's very much rooted in basically like dog training, in essence, is that when you see a behavior that you don't like, you're punished, or that your reward is withheld, mm-hmm. until the behavior in which they do approve of is, expressed and continually. Yeah. which is problematic on so many levels, in the sense that, one, these are actually children who are very easily manipulated
Yes.
and easily influenced, clearly, because so they don't even have a clear understanding of who they are fully yet.
Yeah.
Secondly, suppressing somebody's natural tendencies to do anything, regardless if you're autistic or not, or whether gay, autistic, whatever the case is, it comes at a huge cost. And for autistic specifically, it comes at a cost of our mental health.
Yes.
And our comfort with who we are. And if you're teaching a kid that significant parts of what makes them are wrong, you're basically invalidating who they are. So what happens is then the kids internalize it as, I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm not normal in a bad way. And therefore I need to change parts of who I am and what I do because they're wrong.
Yes.
And that in and of itself deflates a child's sense of self and empowerment and self-love, and it just erodes away at it over time.
Yeah.
So that's why at the root of it, that's the main issue with ABA. We should be able to freely stim. We should be able to info dump. We should be able to, be sensitive and show emotion and cry and feel all of the things that we feel because of our hyper empathy, not for a lack of empathy. And just be who we are. And that should be enough, and that should be accepted, and not only accepted, but supported, because difference is what makes this world beautiful in so many ways. So
absolutely. Yeah. And it, like you said, it's teaching autistic people to be more holistic. And so that causes shame in who we actually are, fear to be ourselves, a loss of self. It teaches us to mask, and excessive masking leads to autistic burnout. So again, ABA has this underlying, cure rhetoric, right? They want us to be less autistic, which is cure rhetoric. And, the long-term effects of autistic burnout and masking and CPTSD, which we touched briefly on, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And people pleasing is the other part of it. And so in ABA, often autistics will learn a thing called people pleasing, which is we literally can see when we make people happy and when we make people sad, when people are mad, when people we can recognize that a lot of times. And so we are so empathetic. We don't want other people to be sad or upset, right? It may not always seem that way because there's a lot of other stuff happening for us, but we don't at the end of the day. But ABA teaches us to people please, which makes us more vulnerable to abuse.
Exactly.
Makes us less likely to be able to recognize abuse from other people throughout our lives. And so there are so many things that are harmful that's rooted in ABA. And I know it's so difficult to hear this, especially if you're a parent or a caregiver that is tied to ABA, or you're an ABA therapist yourself. Like I had a couple reach out to me after our first episode, just saying how hard it was to listen to. And I want to thank you for taking in the information and listening and really having those conversations about how we can do better. Right? Because at the end of the day, I think that's what all of us want, is we want to make sure that we do better for the autistic kids that are growing now, so that when they become autistic adults, they aren't struggling the way that so many of us are. They haven't gone through some of the things that we've had to go through. And so I think these are important conversations. So I honor that they're difficult to listen to. And I appreciate that you continue to listen and you hang with us and you have those conversations with us in a way that we can help, the next group of autistics coming up through the world, because it is, you know, very harmful. And, you know, teaching people to mask in and of itself is so harmful. And that's a whole different episode that we're going to do. But that piece of teaching masking and people pleasing, and then it leading to becoming more vulnerable to abuse is a piece that often is missed in this conversation. And I just feel like it's important to bring that to light as well. Like, a lot of these damages will happen later, not during the actual therapy, right? And this can be 40 hours a week that a child goes through of ABA therapy, you know? So this is intense therapy a lot of times. And, you know, it's measured based on, you know, like how well an autistic child is doing is based on neurotypical standards. So again, it's that perpetuation of the neurotypical life is the life that we all need to lead. And that is harmful and damaging.
Yeah. I was just about to touch on that and say that a lot of parents are in support of it because they have these fears that their child is never going to be fully accepted by society without being perceived as quote unquote normal.
Yes.
And my response to that is that the world needs to change. Your autistic child does not. And I say this with the parents that are my clients. The number one thing that you can do for your child, especially autistic child, is for them to feel validated. The whole of the world is neurotypical, which invalidates every single aspect of who we naturally are. So if you create that safe space of your child having a place to be authentically themselves without being penalized, without being invalidated, without there being pressure to change in any way, shape, or form, if you surround them with members of the family that understand them, friends, connection, support groups, other autistic parents, kids, whatever you can, so that they can see a reflection of themselves in other people, that connection and that sense of a safe space and support can do wonders. And when I say wonders, it can literally change all those quote unquote behaviors that you think are deemed problematic, which is actually just language and them expressing themselves. But with that aside, I promise you, in a very short amount of time, those behaviors will shift for the better, because it's at the root of a lot of our trauma. It's just the constant invalidation that we get. So if you have that safe space and you send your child off into the world, they always have a community and a village to come back to when the world treats them poorly. So instead of focusing on changing your child for the world, focus on creating a world for your child and have that support for them. And if they have that backing, it won't matter what the world says or does, because they have the support that they need. And it's one thing to be isolated, which a lot of autistics are, especially in adulthood, because we struggle with communication and connections and friendships. It's one thing to have that invalidation and be alone than it is to have that invalidation and be like, you know what, but that's them, because I have my whole people in my community, in my village over here.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to tell parents. It's not a matter of forcing your kids. Your kids are going to always, be perceived as different, and them being perceived as different has nothing to do with who they are or their value. That has to do with how the other people perceive them, and that's not your responsibility. That's not anybody's responsibility, nor is it any your child's business necessarily. Right. You know what I mean? Like, what other people think about you is none of your business. And so people are going to perceive quote unquote weirdness and difference as negative and inferior, whatever the case is. But as long as your child knows that that's not the reality and they have a safe space, it won't matter. It really won't. And I promise you that it won't. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen autistic kids, once I work with their parents, and the parents come back to me and they're just like, oh my gosh, I don't believe that this is like the same child, and so much has shifted in such a short amount of time. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, because having that support means a lot. It means the world to us. So it's about our world, not the world out there.
Yeah, I think one of the things about an autistic community and the people that, you know, I've been able to witness their experiences and that kind of stuff is that we don't need everyone to like us, right?
We really don't. We don't care
One
for
person
everyone
is
to
cool.
like us.
Like one person to have our back is cool. And so to the caregivers, to the family members, to the people that love someone that's autistic, when you are promoting a therapy that brings them shame, you become no longer are you a safe person that has their back. And that is something that I think is so important to talk about and to recognize. Like, we just need one person that has our back in this world, like truly has our back. And if we don't have that, and we're in a therapy that is causing us shame and grief and pain and more confusion, then not only are we struggling with that, but we also don't have just one person to turn to where we can be our true, honest, vulnerable self, where we can have a meltdown and know that it's safe. Right. And that is so sad. Like, it makes me so emotional to think about, because it's something that a lot of autistic people are trying to communicate, because maybe they're non-speaking, or maybe they're unable to process and have that conversation. It never gets to the parent, the importance of the lack of support and trust that comes from putting us into these type of therapies, which, again, I recognize is you doing what you think is the best thing in the moment, and we can honor that, and we can also take it for what it is and make sure that we don't continue to perpetuate it. You know, and just making sure that each autistic person has one person that, you know, is support for them and is a safe place for them to go and not have to mask. And ABA teaches us to mask. So, you know, that's that. So I think go ahead.
I just want to say, and again, I just want to reiterate what you said earlier. You're not necessarily going to see the negative effects of ABA within a child. You're most likely what's going to happen is they're most likely going to eventually have a meltdown when they're older, because they have used so much energy and time and emotion suppressing who they are. They're going to have an identity crisis. And then they're most likely going to have a meltdown, and then and burnout. And not just the meltdown, but actual burnout, where they don't have any more energy, desire to do anything, and just fall apart. So what you perceive now as growth, or what you perceive now as positive effects, it has a long-term cost. And that's what I think parents don't realize. They're just like, oh, but they're doing so well, and you can barely tell that they're autistic. So that means they're not going to get bullied, and they're not going to get traumatized when they go to high school and in life, because they've learned how to be quote unquote neurotypical.
Doesn't work like that.
Until they can't, you know what I mean? And until they fall apart, and until they have CPTSD, because they have no idea who they are anymore. And that the therapy has erased all the authentic things that make them happy, that brings them joy, that empowers them, that makes them feel valid and supported and different in all the beautiful ways that they naturally are. And so I also want parents to understand that. So just know that what you perceive as quote unquote improvement or betterment has a cost, long-term cost. So
for sure. For sure. Which I think is why it's so important to listen to autistic adults that have grown through. And, you know, a lot of people here will say, well, you two didn't even go through ABA therapy, which is valid, right? It's a valid thing to say. But what I have done is listen to actual autistic adults that have. I have coached them in my own business, right? I have multiple clients who went through ABA therapy as a child, and now as an adult are dealing with those things. We've posted links on our Facebook page that you can find to actual stories from actual autistic adults that have gone through ABA therapy. So this isn't just us telling, false narratives. This is us bringing to light major problems within the autistic community and just wanting to open up the dialogue to figure out, okay, so what can we do then? And what does that look like? And, we need to do that together as a unit, because I know that ABA therapists, many of you, are doing what you do because you do want to help. And we need you. Like, we need you to help. And also, we need you to listen to us and work with us and not speak for us and speak at us. So I think that would just be my invitation. Like, if you feel like this is a difficult conversation to have, I invite you to reach out to us on social media. Send us a message or comment on one of our posts, and let us know what made you uncomfortable and what your thoughts are on how we can do better for people, because it's an important conversation to have for sure.
There's also research that has been done specifically about ABA and how it does not work. Yeah. So it's not just the narratives. It's not just adult autistics saying they have CPTSD and PTSD from the therapy, but the therapy itself has been criticized and studied, and it does not work. Yeah. So just like conversion therapy for gay people clearly didn't work. It's the same concept, just in a different platform. So if you think gay conversion therapy is atrocious, then you should apply that same mentality to ABA therapy for autistics, because essentially it's the same thing.
For sure. Okay. I think we touched on ABA and gave a little bit more background. So you ready to skip over to talk about some functioning labels? And yes.
So here's the thing about functioning labels. Functioning labels are not helpful for anybody. Two reasons. Well, two main reasons. The first one, for those who are deemed quote unquote high functioning, it prevents us from getting support that we need because we're not struggling enough, quote unquote, to get the help. Like, you're doing so well, you're doing X, Y, and Z, you went to college, you graduated, you have a job, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, you don't need any help. Which is quite frustrating, because the reality of the situation is
you don't see me during a meltdown or burnout or in my home.
Exactly. With the Post-it notes everywhere, or the dishes piled up, or crying, or whatever the case is.
Not able to make food, not able to eat. Like, there are serious issues with functioning labels. Yes.
And even executive dysfunction, huge for us. And so just doing something like, paperwork is overwhelming. And there have been plenty of times where my paperwork has ended up in shreds in the trash as I'm crying, because I struggle with trying to just get it done. It's also why we are constantly told, oh, you don't look autistic, or you don't seem autistic, which is invalidating in and of itself, which we hear already constantly as it is. So it perpetuates that stigma as well. It also, for the functioning labels, creates a hierarchy of those who are quote unquote high functioning somehow are better than, or don't have as many difficulties, or blah blah blah, which isn't necessarily the case at all. Again, who have high support needs, and it limits their ability to grow beyond what others perceive they're capable of, which clearly problematic, because there are a lot of things that autistics would be able to do with the actual genuine and authentic support and understanding that we're actually looking for. So either end of the spectrum, it's not really okay at all. I will also add that Asperger's was previously a diagnosis within the US and the UK in the DSM. It's no longer. I think that they've taken it out since 2015, if I'm not mistaken. because essentially it is a functioning label. It's Asperger's was for quote unquote high functioning autistics, which ironically is not ironically, but it was actually historically rooted in productivity, which is very capitalistic mindsets to begin with. So, so therefore you can function, you can pass for neurotypical, we can put you to work. And that's the root of, you know, what Asperger's was based on, which again, clearly is not okay. We're not mules. And again, the hierarchy, whereas, oh, I'm just quote unquote a little bit autistic. So it perpetuates the stigma that, again, it's not okay to be autistic. And so the more passive you are, the better or like higher valued you are, which clearly is not okay. We're all autistic.
Is not okay, right? And
we're all under the we're all under the umbrella under the spectrum, which is why it's called a spectrum, because it includes a variety of traits and many different combinations.
Exactly. And functioning labels are given based on what someone else sees, right? So if you mask as an autistic person, so we talk about masking a lot, and basically what that is it's showing up as not autistic, right? So doing everything we can to make sure that we don't show our autisticness in life. That's masking. Okay. And it comes in multiple different ways. So functioning labels are given to us. And when we talk about functioning labels, we're talking about Asperger's, we're talking about high functioning, low functioning, mild, severe autism, level 1, 2, and 3. So all of those are functioning labels. And when they're given to us by someone else who only sees us for whatever situation, right? And it's not at all reflective, right? So Asiatu talked about, you know, the point of if you're labeled high functioning, you don't get the support. If you're labeled, you know, low functioning or severe, which is a whole nother conversation, then, you know, you're almost like held down, like almost like people don't expect you to be able to do anything. And one of my main issues with being labeled low functioning or severe is the fact that almost always, if someone is non-speaking, they're automatically put in the severe or the low functioning label. And that is absurd. Like, and
it's not true.
It's not true. Any level. There are so many other ways to communicate other than vocally, other than, you know, speaking. Exactly. And so again, it's just totally off, like totally off base. It doesn't, you know, make sense at all. And it pigeonholes us into these labels that aren't even accurately, you know, they're not even accurate for our experience. You know, like I said, Asiatu and I would both be labeled high functioning because you're watching us on a podcast, right? You're watching us on a video. But there are other autistics who wouldn't want to do this, wouldn't be able to do this. But they are so much higher functioning on things like computer skills, filling out forms, right? I can't do that stuff at all, you know? And it's, you know, we talked about on our first episode, or maybe the first bonus episode, about, you know, trying to get a job, right? And having to fill out forms. It's so difficult for a lot of quote unquote high functioning autistics to be able to fill out those forms, right? It is so difficult for us to be able to function on a daily basis, all around things that affect other people. So because they don't affect other people, they label us as high functioning, and it is a major problem. Major problem. So, and it's
neurotypical, again, like you were saying, neurotypical standards. So you're judging us, who you know is neurodivergent and different mindset and, you know, different operating system, but you're judging us based off of neurotypical standards, which at the root is what's problematic within the medical field. Because we develop differently because we have a different operating system. It's like,
because we're different.
It's not they're exactly, it's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't sit up there and talk about oranges, having Apple as the standard, talking about, yeah, oranges lack crunch. Like
Right.
they're not shaped properly, and they lack crunch. And it's just, that's how, you know, illogical it sounds. How about you just accept the fact that it's an orange, and that, you know, that it's different, and I mean, if you want to take it even further, it's like oranges are the wrong color. They need to be, you know, green and red and yellow. Like, the fact that it's orange, you know, they're wrong. Like, that's the same mentality. Like, just it's so frustrating and infuriating, because, like, yes, we can accomplish things on any level, no matter where we are on the spectrum. And to deny our struggles, again, it's because a lot of our struggles are internalized, and it's not a matter of, it's a very capitalistic, productive way to have standards of quote unquote struggle.
Yeah.
And so just because, you know, I can, you know, live on my own, does not mean that I don't struggle in other areas, like you addressed. One of my big things is I can't go grocery shopping. Or I can rarely go grocery shopping, I should say, but a lot of the times I don't. I either get it ordered, or, you know, my partner does it, which I'm very appreciative of. So yeah, it's just frustrating.
Yeah,
And
like, speaking of the grocery store thing, like, my partner and I know that if we have to go to the grocery store, that's the only thing we're doing that day. So is that high functioning? That's my question. Like, that's it. That's the question. Like,
exactly.
My husband and I get up, and we know we have to go to the grocery store that day, and that's all we can schedule. Is that high functioning? I would say no. Right.
And that's the same with interviews. Interviews are the same way. And interviews, appointments, it's like literally the whole day is all the time before up to the appointment is taken up by getting ready and mentally, emotionally prepping for it. And then afterwards, you know, we're so stressed out and drained from having to socialize.
Gotta reset.
And you have to reset. So the whole day is a wash from doing one thing, yet we're quote unquote high functioning, and we don't need support, which is fucking problematic and frustrating.
Yeah. So, you know, it's all a mess. And so I think what happened was, with a lot of things, humans oversimplify, right? We decided, well, we've got to have a way to, you know, put people in boxes so that we can handle it, situate it, figure it out, whatever. Okay, well, that's not working. So how about we talk about what exact needs are needed for each individual person, and those needs actually get met, right? Because right now, needs aren't being met at all. And so I understand, like, as humans, we try to oversimplify everything, right? But it's not working. So we've got to talk about, you know, the fact that each individual person, whether you're autistic or not, have specific needs. Every single person. They're not special.
Exactly.
They are specific. And when we are not calling out what the specific needs are for each person, then they are getting missed, period, point blank. Like, there's no way for us to shove people in boxes and we fit. Humans are more complex than I think a lot of us recognize. And we continue to try to oversimplify and leave out nuance, and it's damaging. And I think this is just one of the many ways that happens.
I also wanted to just throw out there that schizophrenia used to have levels to it, and they obviously realized that was problematic, and they got rid of them. So my question now is, why is it taking so long with autism? Because it's just as damaging as someone with schizophrenia. And like you were saying, it should be based on individual needs. And to go back, I forgot to mention, it feels a lot of people are wondering, like, well, if not ABA therapy, then what should there be instead? We recommend occupational therapy, speech therapy that is not rooted in pushing people to speak, but just to learn communication and to help basically the person to communicate effectively, and so other people can actually understand their way of communication.
And sometimes that includes, sorry, I want to interject. Sometimes that includes the parent also going to some sort of therapy, right? I have one client who has an autistic child who is non-speaking, and together they are learning ASL, sign language, so that they can have their communication still intact. So sometimes it's not about the autistic person shifting. Sometimes it's about the people around them shifting. And that's a conversation that needs to be had too. So sorry to interject. I know you were on a
No worries. That makes perfect sense. So, and then also, just because somebody's autistic doesn't automatically equate to them needing therapy.
100%.
And that's what people need to realize. So because it is a spectrum, and because each individual autistic has strengths and weaknesses, you can't blanketly just say all autistics need therapy. That's not how it works. I know for me as a child, I would have benefited more from occupational therapy than I would have from like emotional therapy type, the typical traditional therapy. Just to have a better understanding of how my body works, because I have dyspraxia, which is more so like basically an overall clumsiness and coordination issues and things of that nature. I also have dysgraphia, which is basically the same thing, but and specifically as it pertains to gripping things and like holding a pen or a pencil. So if I had more OT and focusing on that as opposed to the emotional aspect of things would have benefited me way more. And then feeling more comfortable and confident within my body, within myself, and having an understanding would have helped me, that I probably wouldn't have been as anxious. I probably wouldn't have been as depressed. So the root of it is just like the emotional therapy was dealing with the symptoms, but at the root was my autism, which, wasn't ever discovered.
Right.
So yeah, I tell parents that all the time, that unless your child obviously is in distress, and some autistic kids, are, and have other co-occurring, mental health issues that do need therapy. But if that's not the case, then there's no need to automatically just assume like, oh, they're autistic, oh, they need therapy. That's not how it works.
Right.
That's not helpful.
And it's not an easy answer to hear, but sometimes you have to figure out what it is that your autistic child needs, right? Because occupational therapy will help for some people, it won't help for other people, and that's how it's going to be for everything. And that's why boxes are made, to make it easier, but easy isn't working in this part of life. So, we also, Asiatu and I both have clients that come to us for resource to help kind of figure that out, right? Like, okay, this is what I've tried. What other options are out there? So that's work that Asiatu and I both do, on top of, occupational therapy and the other therapies that we recommend for people outside of the typical ABA therapy, or just letting people suffer.
Exactly.
So you had talked about Aspergers. Can we go back a little bit and retouch?
Sure.
Okay. So Asperger's is definitely an issue for the hierarchy piece of things, right? So I know that when I was younger, there are two memories that I have of people that I know being diagnosed autistic. And at the time, Asperger's was the diagnosis that they received. And in both occasions, the person that was telling me that the autistic person had received their diagnosis said it to me in a way of, oh, but they just have Asperger's.
Yes.
Right. And that alone is problematic and toxic to the rest of our autistic community. It's a hierarchy that is not needed. And I know that there are people, Harry Thompson, which I know that we both follow online had put out a conversation about this as well, and how Asperger's is problematic for multiple reasons. And we know that there are people within the community that are tied to that label. They like to be an Aspie, which is fine to be tied to something. But it's time that we have the conversation about how that's problematic, and that we start shifting the narrative away from I'm an Aspie to I'm an Audi. Because at the end of the day, we are all autistic. And just because I can sit here and do this doesn't make me any better than someone who cannot, period. And it is super problematic to continue that hierarchy. I know that you agree. So let's talk about the other issue with Asperger's, which is where it came from. So Hans Asperger was a doctor. He was a Nazi doctor. And Asperger got to decide which children that were autistic got to live and which children did not. Which ones were smart enough, which ones looked the most quote unquote normal, and which ones did not. And that is where the term Asperger comes from. Hans Asperger, a Nazi doctor who decided which autistics lived and which autistics did not, based solely on how much he thought that they could give back to society. That is eugenics, and that is not okay. And so regardless of all the rest of the stuff that we've said, Asperger's comes from and is rooted in the genocide of our own community of autistics. And to continue saying the name just by that alone is triggering, and it is harmful, and we've got to stop using it.
I agree.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's not in the DSM for the US and the UK, and I'm sure other countries will follow suit eventually, should show you and tell you that it is not okay. Like, it's no longer being used, because humanity as a whole, we're constantly evolving and changing and using our language and assessing, historical context and things of that nature. That's part of what makes humanity, a forever evolving species. Yeah. So it's like basically calling a Black person colored in 2021. It's outdated, it's offensive, and it just needs to stop. Yeah. And you can sit there and say, oh, but I want to call Black people colored because, in my day, that's what we called them. I don't care what you want to do. You can want.
It is no longer your day,
it's not,
sir.
Exactly. It is no longer back in the day. It is 2021. It is not acceptable. It is not okay. I don't care who's using it. I don't care if you're part of the community, not part of the community. The reality of the situation is it's triggering. It's toxic. It needs to end. It's time to move forward from it.
Yeah, I agree. So let's just skip over to racism, since we started that conversation a little bit. And it's a conversation that we need to have, not only in our community, but in all of the communities, especially the white ones. So racism in advocacy is a conversation that has come up here more so recently within our autistic community. But again, a conversation that needs to continue to be had. The importance of true advocacy is listening to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and melanated people within our community. Honestly, this conversation needs to be had in all different sectors of life. And so I hope that you stick around for it. So to set this up for anyone that's not watching or hasn't seen us, I, Mary, am white, and Asiatu is Black. So as we discuss our experiences, it may be something worth noting for you. I'll always be speaking through the lens of a white person. As someone that works daily to be anti-racist, one of the people that I turn to the most is our very own Asiatu. So aren't you lucky to be here for this conversation? If you're looking for guidance on how to be anti-racist or a better ally, please go to the source. Asiatu is a great coach, and you can find them at asiatucoach on IG, Facebook, and on Twitter. So All right. So what even is true advocacy and why are we talking about it? Well, because specifically this month, we've had multiple disruptions of advocacy events throughout the month, and they've all kind of had an underlying theme of the fact that we are not listening to each other and that organizations are a consistent problem. So Asiatu, I know that this has been actively discussed on your platform. So let's get a little bit deeper for our listeners. Let's talk about advocacy, what it is, the issues and the racism that comes in and problems with organizations. So I'm just going to kind of let you take it away here.
Okay. So I'll start with the organizations. There have been a lot of organizations within the autism community that basically say that they're doing the work and that they're helping autistics and raising money and blah, blah, blah. The reality is they're not. They're harming the community and they're problematic. Autism Speaks being one, that's the biggest one that spends the most money on propaganda and marketing to perpetuate their just toxicity of finding a cure, blah, blah, blah. They have updated their language and their speech, but bottom line is they still support ABA, which is what we talked about earlier, which is problematic. So that in and of itself just cancels them out. There was Color the Spectrum is an event that's going on, I believe today or in a couple of days with celebrities that is very connected to Autism Speaks, that also has cure language and other issues. So organizations, I will say, from the lens of intersectionality of the disabled community, specifically the autistic community, is one that's very dicey. There's also the lens of a lot of these are very white-centered organizations that don't even recognize or highlight or engage with the Black, brown, indigenous, melanated community or autistics. So intersectionality matters on every level and it's not being addressed. Now, specifically within the autistic community, as with any other system, it's very white-centered and that is a problem. Black autistics, Black, indigenous, melanated, Black, brown, indigenous, melanated autistics have to fight for space, have to fight for marketing, have to fight for just growing their following way more so than clearly white autistics. A lot of the times our voices are muted or are, I would say, like the things that happen against us, offenses that are rooted in racism that happen against us are usually brushed under the rug. And there's an incident that happened within our community earlier this month and it garnered a whole lot of attention, and then there was a specific white autistic named Beck Spectrum who their intention was to create a platform to go against the Color the Spectrum event. And it ended up being at the expense of the Black, brown, indigenous, melanated community. They tried to rationalize it by saying, well, it's a lesser of two evils in the sense of Autism Speaks and Color the Spectrum was huge, large organizations that are problematic, therefore rationalizing going against them at the expense of the BBIMP community was okay. It's never okay. And the whole thing is people are saying, well, like that's the whole point. Like BBIMP people are constantly devalued. We're constantly exploited. We're constantly ignored. We're constantly hurt and bulldozed over by the majority, muted even, especially when we speak out and try to hold white people accountable. there's all this backlash, which is actually what I'm getting because I've been trying to hold Beck Spectrum accountable. I will say that Beck posted an apology, which was very well written, but it wasn't authentic, clearly evident by the fact that they deleted the evidence of their mistakes. And also there's now more information coming out that they've tokenized, Black people that were involved in the event. And I wanted to take this time to address the people that are saying that I'm being hateful or that I'm being bullying or I'm bullying Beck Spectrum. I'm not doing either of those things. There's no slander because nothing I said has, been false. Nothing I've said has been intended to harm Beck. But what I will continue to do is hold Beck Spectrum accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
And this whole mentality of, bullying them and prioritizing Beck's white feelings over the consequences of hurting the BBIMP community is what allows white supremacy to thrive. Mm-hmm. And it's not okay.
Yeah.
Also, there are people who are coming at me that are just like, well, why are you spreading such hate, blah, blah, blah. Why are you targeting, Beck Spectrum? Because it's not just Beck Spectrum. Beck Spectrum is one of millions of white people that uphold a system. That's why it's called systemic racism. So it's all interconnected. It's like a web. And so every atrocity against BBIM people is compounded by history, life events, and everything else. So they're not isolated. They don't happen in a vacuum. And so with every incident, it's upholding and affirming white supremacy, which equates to the pain and the suffering of oppressed people.
Yeah, I think it's, so powerful what the work that you do, and also the importance of recognizing that it's not bullying, it's accountability. Mm-hmm. And how people react to being held accountable is each of our own journey, right? So exactly. As a white person, I can see the uncomfortable feelings spewing through that video, the apology video, right? So it's not that we think that it was done on purpose. This isn't blatant racism. This is systemic racism. This is the stuff that happens every single day that hasn't been called out in the public. I'm not saying it hasn't been called out because there have been, Black, brown, indigenous, melanated people talking about this forever. But white people, myself included, have got to be held accountable for the damage that we do. And it is our privilege as white people to be in those spaces. So Beck Spectrum put themselves in that space. And now it is up to Beck Spectrum to be held accountable and to sit with the uncomfortability. Mm-hmm. It was hard for me to watch as a white person. I won't lie. It was hard for me to watch that video from them because I've been there. But you know what? As white people, until we are held accountable, we continue to harm people without even recognizing it. And it's not okay. It's not okay. And so if you are a white person, I'm talking to you now. This is not our time to get offended by being held accountable. This is not our time to say that we're being bullied. This is our time to sit and listen and reflect and recognize that there has been a lot of pain done, not just right here today. Generations of this same invalidation and erasing of voices, of experiences, and we've got to stop. We've got to stop. So do I feel bad that people are being hurt? Of course, Asiatu feels that too. Asiatu has been hurt.
Exactly.
Like there's more than just the pain of Beck Spectrum here. And we've got to make sure that the white people's uncomfortable feelings aren't taking precedent again. And that
Exactly.
is, you know, like, that's the point. And so, you know, I just thank you, Asiatu, for your voice always, and for sharing here, and for sharing on, you know, your page so passionately. And, you know, I talked about in our last bonus episode about how privileged we are to have people like you that know that speaking is going to get backlash, right? You've already been
Oh,
getting
yes.
it. People are unfollowing
Yes.
your page. People are sending you messages.
Yep.
You know, that's not okay. There are boundaries that need to be put in place, even for people that are activists and advocates. So if you as a white person feel like you need to message Asiatu, I want you to take a moment and reflect and make sure that it is something that needs to be said, because I doubt it is. I mean,
And I want to say,
truly.
I also want to say that it's not that any Black person expects white people to be perfect, especially as it pertains to anti-racism work or, you know, dismantling white supremacy. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to continually hold yourself and others accountable for the mistakes that you make. Good character is not an absence of mistakes. Good character is, what do you do after you're held accountable for your mistakes? And if in that moment you get defensive, if in that moment you deny, if in that moment you perpetuate the erasure of other people's voices and deny the historical context and connection to oppression, then that makes you a shitty person. It's not all white people are racist because it's a system. A fish cannot live and thrive in water and not be wet. That's just not how it works. Racism also isn't just a morality issue, it's a systemic issue. So it's not a matter of racism automatically making you a bad person, like I just said.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you a bad person is not doing the anti-racist work, is not constantly calling out other white people who are doing the same thing. It's not highlighting the voices of other people's experiences who are oppressed. All those things, not doing those things is what makes you a shitty person.
Right.
Is racism shitty? Yes. If you're overtly racist and you have these beliefs and you don't care to do anything about it, that makes you a shitty person. But racism systemically as a whole doesn't necessarily equate to you being a bad person. But again, racism isn't just about morality. It's about a system that has been built and perpetuated by white privilege, white power, and this underlying falsehood that white is superior than to anything else. So I invite people to think about that. And so again, stop prioritizing your hurt feelings over the realities and the consequences of your actions. And the fact that Beck Spectrum deleted her posts and deleted the live in which people were trying to hold her accountable, to me, is inauthentic accountability. Because if you are truly accountable, you're going to leave the evidence so that people can see that you own up to it and that you've learned from it and that you will speak to it of how you were wrong and how you will do the work and how you will make it up. And all it shows is Beck could not sit in her discomfort and prioritized her discomfort over the feelings of the Black, Indigenous, melanated people in which she was hurting.
Yeah.
And that's problematic. And that's classic white privilege and classic white behavior. And it needs to stop. Another aspect is, don't feel entitled to our education. Don't feel entitled to our space. Don't feel entitled, and by our, I mean Black, Indigenous, melanated, Black, brown, Indigenous, melanated people. If you want information more so than what I already give freely, which is a lot of labor, if you want more information, then the first thing out of your mouth should be, I want some more information. What are your rates?
Yes.
How can I compensate you for your time, your labor, your emotion?
Yes.
And that's just not just with me, that's with any oppressed person.
Yes.
Do not just assume and do not just feel entitled to our labor and our emotion and our time. That's racist and rooted in racism, because Black people have never been valued enough, as it goes back to slavery, that our labor is supposed to be free and white people are entitled to it. And that's just trickled down to today.
Yeah.
So that in and of itself is being racist.
Yes.
Check your privilege, check your privilege, check your privilege, compensate people, and stop playing the victim. Because the reality is, at the end of the day, you still have privileges, you still have resources, you still have benefits that we don't have, point blank, period. and that we won't have access to because we still get backlash. That's another aspect of it. Like, the more I speak out against white supremacy, the more Facebook limits my reach, which means that I don't get as many followers, which means I don't get as much engagement, which means that, guess what? I don't get sponsorship, which means that I don't get money, which means that I can't thrive. And which means that, I'm struggling because I'm actually doing the right thing.
Yes.
Sit in your discomfort. Discomfort is necessary at times for growth. Yeah. It's not something that you have to react automatically and be defensive of. What is your discomfort telling you? Sit in that moment, sit and process, think about it, analyze it, assess it. What is it telling you? Because it's telling you something. Being triggered and being defensive means that there's a wound and something that needs to be addressed, so that you can grow and evolve and become better.
Yeah. And it's okay, to make mistakes. Asiatu has said it a million times, and I want to say it again. Like, it's okay to make mistakes. Exactly. Asiatu's not mad. I'm not mad about the mistakes, right? Like, I remember the first time I was really called out on my privileges. The first time I was really called out on my privileges, and it was from someone that, I cared about deeply. And I took months sitting with what they said, going through, like, offline. This was years ago. And I completely got offline because I really started questioning everything in my life. And so I understand that that's what can happen, and it can be a really scary place to, like, start questioning everything in your life. And that's valid, right? We're all people at the end of the day. Your wounds are real, regardless of your life experience. Your wounds are real. And so talking about Beck Spectrum and this situation isn't an attack on Beck Spectrum. It is bringing to light an issue. And when Beck Spectrum deleted everything, it deleted labor of the Black, brown, indigenous, melanated people that were trying to bring things to light, but it also deleted the opportunity for other white people or other people holding privilege to learn. And Beck Spectrum at that point stopped being an advocate, because part of advocacy is helping people learn. Part of advocacy is holding a space where people can grow. And by deleting our own errors, our own mistakes, our own blind spots, we delete our privilege as activists, as educators, as people wanting to support community. And so it's important that when we make a post and it doesn't go well, we leave it, because other people are watching, other people are witnessing, other people are learning. And so if you're a true advocate, if you're really here to do the work for our communities, you have to be able to have that space all the time. And that means not deleting things that don't go the way you wanted them to go or that are uncomfortable for you, because you always have to remember that there are other people watching. There are other people that can learn. There is effort and time that goes into these conversations. As white people, when we are curious about the experience of Black, brown, indigenous, melanated people, that's their emotional labor. We're just curious. So it's important to recognize that it is emotional. It's the same for, the queer community, the trans community. When you go to people, when you go to the source to learn, you have to recognize this is their lived experience. This is emotional. And so if they come off quote unquote angry, if you don't like their quote unquote tone, that's a you problem, right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so it's important to take the education for what it is, to leave the conversations where they are. That is true advocacy, right? That is supporting our communities, is supporting everyone in our communities. So, I so much appreciate you. Anything else about this that you want to add?
I just wanted to add one more thing is
Absolutely.
when white people delete their mistakes, it lends itself to a lack of accountability, but that's also historically what has happened. White people have whitewashed history, have erased their violence against, Black, brown, indigenous, melanated people.
Mhm.
So we can't fight against something that has no evidence, which essentially is what allows white supremacy to thrive, and why in 2021 you have a whole bunch of white people talking about systemic racism isn't real, because the evidence has been erased. So if you erase the evidence, you erase the accountability, but you also erase the ability for us as the oppressed to be able to hold people accountable and to be able to say our pain is valid.
Yes.
Because this happened. And if you take that away, then our pain is nullified. And that's how white supremacy perpetuates. Also, in erasing it, they get freedom from accountability. They get freedom of their discomfort. We as oppressed people never get to experience that. We can't just check out of racism when we want to. We can't take off our skin. Yeah. We don't have that luxury of just not being held accountable, not only for our own mistakes, but for the mistakes of white people and other people and other privileged people. We don't get that freedom. So think about that too. So when people say, oh, well, should they have just reposted it and wouldn't that cause more problems? First of all, I never said anything about reposting. That is besides the point. I'm not speaking to what should happen in the aftermath. I'm speaking to what shouldn't have happened to begin with. Beck should not have deleted the posts or the live, point blank, period. And it's very privileged of them that they feel that they can, again, because we don't get to check out. We don't have that privilege. We're always dealing with racism. We're always dealing with consequences. We're always being held accountable, even beyond our own accountability. Mm-hmm. So it's just more evidence of just white racism and privilege and fragility and all the other things. So it's not okay. It's very frustrating, and it's just invalidating to us, and which is part of the problem. So I don't want to hear about her feelings. I'm sorry, their feelings. I don't know what their pronouns are. I don't want to hear about Beck's feelings. I don't want to hear, oh, you just need to spread love. No, I don't need to spread love. What I need to do is hold people accountable so that things will actually shift and change for the better. Because without accountability, nothing's going to change. Without acknowledgement, nothing's going to change. You can't change a problem you don't acknowledge. And erasing evidence means you can't acknowledge it.
Yes. Oh, I appreciate you so much. I can't tell you how lucky we are to have you in our community and speaking and taking up space. Asiatu, thank you so much. To our listeners, be sure to, follow them at asiatucoach on IG, Twitter, and on Facebook. We mentioned the term BBIMP or BIMP or Black, Brown, Indigenous, Melanated People. That is a term that was coined by @accordingtowheeze on Instagram. So you can also check them out. They're also a coach and an activist and share a ton of good information. So there are people out there. Go to the source, listen, take the time you need to reflect, and don't dirty delete is what we call that. We call it dirty deleting when we just go in and delete stuff because it makes us uncomfortable. So these conversations need to be had. And, you know, I'm privileged and honored to be here and witness you in, you know, as you grow and you continue to educate people. I'm, you know, so excited for our community to have you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you all for joining us for our next bonus episode, a carryover from episode 1 on Autism April, where, you know, we talked about all kinds of things today. So thank you so much for being here. We release new episodes monthly, but if you want to receive more content like this, one-on-one communication, or just want to support us, we would love to have you join us on our Patreon, where we offer exclusives, merchandise, bonus episodes, and live interactive chat forums. You can also find us on social media. We're at audacious.autistics. And you can email us directly at audacious.autistics@gmail.com. Be sure to share your stories and your questions with us on social media, because we love to connect with our community.
Yay. And I also just wanted to add, we had mentioned the term autistic earlier, which is basically the opposite of autistic.
Yes.
So someone who does not have autism is called allistic, ALL-istic, and versus autistic. So I just wanted to throw that out there if people were lost.
Thank you.
And as always, thanks for being here. Tune in May 8th to our next episode in our All the Things series titled Mental Health Stigma. And in the meantime, continue to live unmasked and out loud.